So wonderful to have you all with us today. We are very excited about this space and this time together. I am Sarah Jane Walker. I'm the president of TMN and your host in this space today. We deeply believe that the good news is that God is active ahead of us. The Spirit is at work in our neighborhoods and communities, and we are seeing ways in which pastors and leaders are partnering with their congregations to discern the work of the Spirit and to join with God. Today we have incredible guides in this topic, Mark Lau Branson and Alan Roxburgh, and they're going to invite us into conversation, story, and theological reflection around some of both the challenges and the opportunities in discerning the work of the Spirit and joining with God. I am going to just pop up their bios in case you'd like a little more legitimacy and to know a little bit more about who they are. So you can find that in the chat if you're interested. But really, I'd like to just quickly let you know what the hour is going to look like and then hand things over to Alan and Mark to get started for us. Majority of our time will be with Alan and Mark reflecting. They're pretty comfortable doing this. They've taught lots of classes together, and this is a really they're in their element and they love this space, this reflecting and learning together. So it's a treat to be with them in the midst of that. Al is also going to be sharing an opportunity to join a learning community to explore further this topic. And then we're going to conclude with a Q&A, which we hope will be quite robust and give some space and time to that so we can have some more interactive time around some of the ideas and the stories and the interactions from Alan and Mark. So again, thank you for being with us. And Alan and Mark, I hand it over to you to lead us in this time.
Yeah, well, thank you. Sarah Jane has pointed out, Mark and I are both good friends and teaching colleagues, and have journeyed a great deal together around these questions and issues of being God's people in our world today. In fact, about 2.5 weeks ago, we spent a week together in this wonderful little place called Ojai, Southern California, up in the desert area, where we are constructing and writing a book together on a biblical theology of leadership. So this is a great time for the two of us to be in interaction with you. So Mark, let me just turn it over to you, and let's enter the conversation.
Yeah, no, glad to do this. Glad to be here. Glad to have all of you participating, and that's what we're going to make sure we have enough time created for. So on the topic that we're working on today of just this issue of if God is primary agent, if God is active, then that shifts our understanding of what a church is, how a church then, rather than seeking to follow particular scripts, is about discerning what God is up to, discerning how that particular church, those people might participate with God's initiatives. So, Alan, maybe to get us started, you spent a lot of time in denominational groupings with individual congregations and such. What are you seeing gets in the way of congregations and their leaders regarding this kind of discernment, participatory life with God?
Yeah, at one level, it sounds easy and simple and straightforward to say that God is at work, God is out ahead of us, God's up to stuff. And we believe that and can tell lots of stories about it. But actually, it's not as simple and straightforward as it sounds. And there's lots of reasons for that, not the least of which is that all of us as leaders, as pastors particularly, is that we have embodied in us or embedded in us these defaults that are not always the way we think, but are the habits that shape us. And what I find is that most pastors, most congregational leaders, they know, along with their congregations, that the ways of being church and the ways of practicing leadership that have been present for such a very long time are simply not working. But at the same time, there's still amongst leaders this desire to try to figure out a new process or program or initiative to engage their people or get them working. And so I still see a lot of pastors using what I call binders, their assessment materials, or here are 5 steps, and if you follow these 5 steps, or here's the latest discipleship program. If you can just get your people into this discipleship and get them moving, things will change. Or people reading books where they take formulas. Here's what missional looks like, and if missional is A plus B plus C, and you put these together, you'll get something else. I just find a great deal of that going on. And in a sense, what I see still happening is that leaders themselves are trying to initiate change from within themselves, their skill sets, or the churches, in the hope that God is present in that and will bless it. And most of this is trying to push or form or get people inside something that the leaders are figuring out. And so that's what I see going on. And therefore, there's a great deal of struggle still to understand what does it mean for God to be the primary agent. And what I'm experiencing and engaging in, and for me, the metaphor of the table is a critical one. Meet people where they are, and where they are is next to their homes and their neighbors, communities, and to listen to what the Spirit is doing, both amongst people in our churches and in the neighborhoods and communities where they live.
There is a norm in which that pushes toward homogeneity, like attracts like. And so before long, Care for the Local is, again, a networked group of people who are like each other. There are several that have done some pretty amazing work, actually, even in boundary crossing, ethnically, socioeconomically, and then out of doing things that I think are really important. Starting to engage that relationships are often a lead toward how do we organize to solve some particular civic issues locally with other organizations. And then again, the habits take over that those organizing structural initiatives take all of the energy of the church. And so while they started in these conversations among neighbors in diverse settings, all of a sudden they're back into building institutions, and all of the energy goes into building and maintaining institutions. I'm not a critic of that, because I really do believe that creating those kind of civic institutions is important and is an appropriate place for the church to be involved. But it's that the habit is that your metaphor of table, if we lose out on the table, both the table in the church and the church people, and the table in the neighborhood, and these other kind of activities take over, then all of a sudden, I was with a pastor joking the other day, we only needed the Holy Spirit at the first, because from there on we know what we're doing. And he was saying that in lament, appropriately so, that we know how to build organizations and do all kinds of good things. And so what he was saying in that particular situation is, how do we get these habits of table with neighbors, even as we are doing these other good civic partnerships and organizational partnerships? And that's and this pushes into the leadership issues that you're raising.
Yeah, and some of this is what we would call imagination, and it goes very deep. That the table, you think of the table where Jesus meets the disciples, or lots of places where Jesus is sitting at table and eating and conversation, that this is the shift of imagination, because my observation would be that many, many leaders are still thinking about pew or building, gathering place as the primary metaphor within which they're working, whereas the table is in the home, in the neighborhood, in the community. So that's the big shift. But the other thing I would observe, Mark, is that even as we talk about this with a lot of pastors, their eyes light up and they have a lot of energy around this. but will come back and say things like, I get that, but I have no practical idea, or I feel already overwhelmed in trying to manage and look after the needs of the people and the demands of the people in my congregation, that I have no time left to do this sort of thing. Or a sense of them saying, I just feel isolated where I am, and not knowing where I can connect with others to go on that journey. So these are some of the other things that are shaping people's responses to what we're talking about. I don't know what your observation would be on.
You know, it reminds me in our Doctor of Ministries courses that we taught together, in the midst of obviously brilliant lectures and all the other wonderful things we did, most of the time, the single most important step was the year in which we say pastors needed to spend 20% of their time in their communities, either near their church, near their home, but without their collar. No official status, simply be a neighbor among neighbors. And after their faces went white, and then fears about talking with church boards beyond that, most of the time it was that next 6 months, in the midst of other practices, lectio, examine, prayer, prayerful conversations, that it's pretty hard to discern what God might be doing in the neighborhood unless you're in the neighborhood. One of our favorite educators of the middle of the last century, Henrietta Mears, would say you can't steer a parked car. And so if we're going to be participating in identifying, seeing God, then it's really important to be out there. And consistently, as we've worked with clusters of churches, as they started doing that, and then the other critical issue of sharing those stories, both inside among the particular congregation, but then between congregations, the confidence, the faithfulness builds, the capacity to see builds, the capacity to know how to listen builds, which is huge. So instead of just listening, as churches often do, what are the needs of this community and how do we solve them? Instead, listening underneath that, what are the emotions in the community? What are the fears? What are the anxieties? What are the loves? What are the passions? What are the desires? And it's a whole different type of listening than, again, what empowered, especially as a white male, what do empowered white males do to fix the neighborhood? And unless I break those habits and come in with a very different posture, I can't increase my capacity to recognize God, who doesn't tend to act in the way that my habits have shaped me. And so it just flips the whole process.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to put a big, thick underline about what you're saying, is that in this work of discerning the Spirit out ahead of us, if we as leaders, as pastors, are not in our own communities, in our own contexts, if we're not learning how to do this around tables where we live, we're probably not going to be able to simply speak and say to people in our congregations, here's what you need to do. So that leading by being present and ahead is just critically important to our own discernment and our own modeling of people. The other thing that I bump into a great deal is that the people of our congregations are really schooled to believe, as Marcus pointed out, that what being in the neighborhood means is to sort of look out for needs and try to meet them, or listen to where people want help and try to help them. And this is just a very deep default, and it's partly why people feel more comfortable, say, doing a demographic analysis or going to interview people who are in positions of leadership in the community, the school principal, the police, the real estate, the mayor, that kind of formal connection. But that's really, it has a place, but it's not what we're talking about. It's how to invite our people to move past those places, which are really about them being in control and bringing something, to literally listen and discern. And so this is why we spend a huge amount of time around tables in community, in neighborhoods, doing what we call this dwelling in the Word. And most of you will have heard a great deal about this. But dwelling is something that people do amongst themselves that doesn't require an expert leader who's ordained and knows text. And it invites people to understand that God meets them as friends around table in Scripture and amongst them. And just that process of dwelling around Scripture together begins to release an unimaginative sense that we can hear God together, that amongst us we can wait upon and listen to what God's up to. And we would never anymore underestimate the power of that coming together around tables and listening to God through dwelling as a critical step in discernment. But it's also a critical step in learning to listen to our own stories. And it's that listening to our own stories that becomes critical to listening to the stories of people in our neighborhood. And Mark, let me pass it back to you. You got lots to say about this.
Well, no, I'm just thinking one of the experiments, my wife was part of the TMN team and is a spiritual director and does spiritual direction with groups, developing those capacities. She and our pastor designed a 3-day process that they called Retreat on the Street. And our church at that time maybe was 20 people. And all they had us do, morning and evening, we were together for Lectio. We'd spend about an hour, hour and a half doing the text and then listening for what happened during the day. And the other assignment was to be in the community, best in pairs, and go to the places that the community gathers. So coffee shop, McDonald's, parks, pubs, those kind of things. And we're in a very mixed community. On one hand, there is significant gang activity. On the other hand, we've got some upcoming economic development. So it's all across the board. And the goal was simply to be in those places and listen, observe who's there, observe what they're doing, without inappropriately eavesdropping. What are the conversations about? Where's their buzz? Where's their sense of neighborliness? And then we'd come back together. So we did this as often as anybody could be in on the early morning, late evening gatherings, and then on into Saturday and Sunday. And the goal was just to be asking the question, okay, if God's active in this neighborhood before we show up, although we all live around there, still, what's God doing? And how is that creating love, justice? Where is there injustice? Where is there brokenness? So all the different dimensions of any civic environment. And without any conversation at first between us, we started noticing the difference in what gathering places were welcoming and which ones weren't in regard to the neighbors. And we were able to say, there's some places that people are gathering, but the people that are gathering aren't from here. They're from other actually wealthier communities nearby. They're driving in to partake of this particular site and then they leave. And then there are other places that really were local. And they were the buzz of the neighborhoods, and from people that had been here for decades to new people, but still the buzz. And they tended to be actually more diverse, more across race and economic issues. And simply knowing that helped us know where we wanted to hang out, right? And it ended up eventually developing some other ways, connections, relationships with the community. But simply going into the community, asking where's God present, doing that while we're doing Lectio together around tables. And so it's that mixing of those tables that's continued to mix up what our church is and how we live in this place.
One of the metaphors that a friend of mine used many, many years ago for this, about what it means to be leadership and discerning of the Spirit, is that really we are those who are cultivating a community who are detectives of divinity. This listening and discerning what God is up to, all that Mark's described. And I just want to reiterate again, in my experience and observations, this is such a massive shift of imagination for us as leaders. Because, again, so much of what's in our bones and our formation is really about, if we as a leader can get the right method or program and give it to our people and train them in it. As I said earlier, if we could just find the right formula for being missional and get our people in it. These are narratives and defaults that I would observe just keep repeating themselves amongst leaders. Whereas what we're talking about is a fundamentally different approach to leadership that in effect lays down those programs, lays down those needs to get people into a formula of what missional is or discipleship is, and goes on a very different kind of journey. And that's the learning space into which Mark and I and others on TMN team are constantly working and seeking to invite leaders to enter and to be, and wouldn't pretend for a minute that that's not anxious space. But that's the space into which the Spirit of God has called us and invited us. It is, you probably, those of you on this have listened intensely to what people say in books, that we live in this new space, this liminal space. We have all this language to describe it. Post this, post that. You get post-exhausted with all the posts. And what that means is that the Spirit of God is bringing us to places that as leaders we have not been before. And therefore, it's about laying down what we know and becoming like novices who are learning new ways. And this is why we keep saying we can't do this by ourselves, but we can in the conviction that God's Spirit, in the midst of the unraveling, is cultivating a new future amongst God's ordinary people. And that's why, as Mark's described, so much of what this leadership of discerning the Spirit about is how we learn to be with and alongside and amongst our people in our neighborhoods, in these places of asking, how are we seeing and listening to the stories of people there? That's the shift in the journey that sounds so easy, but is so massive. Mark, I don't know if you want to make any more comments on that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about some of the passages that we've been working on in connection with the book, that in Philippi, Paul's traveling team got to Philippi because they wanted to go to Western Asia, and they were prevented from that. They were prevented from another stop, and then they have this vision of a man beckoning them to Europe. And as they go to Philippi, after a couple of days, their normal practices evidently don't work if there's no synagogue, right? So they can't go to the synagogue, and they go to out on the stream where they anticipate there's a prayer group, because that, for some reason, is what they're hoping to see. And they meet a group of women praying. Conversation leads to Lydia's conversion. So you've got kind of a table conversation outside of town. They're invited into Lydia's house. So this businesswoman who must have some resources, that becomes a place, another table, and other people are invested and engaged. Now, eventually they get arrested because of the interplay between some local religion and merchandising, and get thrown into prison. Well, that all ends up around the table of the jailer's house, where they all get baptized. So there's several different places this moves, and then back, because they need to leave town, back to Lydia's. But it's this kind of fluidity. There is no strategy for Philippi.
Yeah, exactly.
If they'd had a strategy, they wouldn't have been able to get any of this done. And it's also, we've wondered, how do you deal with the fact that they had a vision of a man, but in fact, Lydia's the one that, whether if God had given them a vision of a woman, they just would have ignored it, or what would have happened. But in any case, the Spirit's working, generating, they're working with some common practices. They're innovating, or they're improvising in the midst of that. And the Spirit of God is just constantly ahead of them, preparing the people who would have known Lydia, who would have known the jailer, that were prepared for this kind of conversation. And they listen enough to understand how to speak into that. And it's just this remarkable story. They're not there real long time. They have to leave fairly shortly. And from the looks of Paul's later letter, that church did pretty well, continuing with that kind of demeanor and sense of participating with God on the ground.
And I think what both of us want to emphasize here is we are not in any way saying we need a new model of church called house church or table church or anything like that.
I think the idea of hanging out on Sunday mornings by a river might be a good idea, though.
Yeah, hanging out by a river on a Sunday morning, if you've got one. But so this is not about some alternative model of church. In fact, what we're talking about is what we are seeing happening in all kinds of churches, whether they are old, established, what some people like to call institutional churches, or whether they're the new groovy things where you can't get in unless you got a ring in your ear. It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
The point is not that. I mean, I was on the East Coast a couple of weeks ago with with an Episcopalian church, with a group of people who looked older than me, and I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the stories of how the Spirit is moving amongst them, and they're connecting in the neighborhoods, and they're listening to people, and I'm going, this happens anywhere and everywhere, particularly where leaders let go of their need for their programs and models to control and begin to create these tables of gathering and listening and little steps of experimenting. That's the context that really, wherever we go, I can talk to Mark as well, if you listen in this way, you just see this bubbling of the Spirit going on. And as if the Spirit is saying to us as leaders, come join. This is where the work is. This is where the future is. It's not about models of church. It's about joining the God who is out ahead of us. So, yeah. Mark, any other things you want to say at this point?
No, let's see where the questions go.
Yeah. Well, let's start to move. We want to invite you to take advantage of the Q&A section where you can write these questions and we can interact with you so it becomes more interactive. And before we get there, just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce you to something that will be coming out of this Discerning of the Movement, Discerning of the Spirit webinar. What we've heard from you, a lot of you, is that this topic of discerning the Spirit is something that you are very interested in, and a lot of you want to go deeper into it. You want to dig deeper to get underneath, okay, we hear this, but actually, how do we do it on the ground in our particular contexts? Because the context in which you live is not the context in which Mark lives or I live. Each is unique. And what that means is there's no magic bullets. There's no binder that if you follow this binder, you'll get down the golden road to the solution. This is really about ways in which we learn to learn from one another. And so what we're wanting to do is to invite any of you who are interested to continue in this learning to learn from one another in what we're calling small cohorts of peers who are coming together around a learning community where we encourage, empower, and learn from each other how to do this work of discerning the Spirit. Now, the learning communities that we're proposing are not add-ons to the already heavy work and busy schedules that you have, but they're actually ways in which you can build into and test out ways of going on this journey in the midst of what you're already doing. So here's what we're proposing. We're inviting you to consider participating in a Joining God learning community around this question for pastors. And we're going to be starting these communities in the new year, in 2017. There's one starting in January. We're just going to start with one. We're going to start another one in May and then one later in September. These learning communities are going to be composed of no more than 6 to 8 of you as pastors meeting together in this kind of format over a 12-month period with an experienced mentor from TNN. The cost of this is minimal. It's $130 a month or a one-time payment of $1,500. And what I'd encourage you to do is to follow the links that will show up in the chat or on our website. There's limited space for the first one, so being on this webinar gives you a priority opportunity to choose a date. So we're offering this, and if you're interested in the first one in January, we'd love you to get in early and sign on by December 1. And we will follow this up with an email to you so that you can engage in this. Okay, what I'd like to do now is invite you into a time of Q&A. What are your questions, and how can Mark and I interact with you? And so let's invite you. You can do that on your Q&A sheet, and I'm going to invite Sarah Jane to come on in and get connected. Mark, there's one. Tim Wren asks, what are your thoughts on digital tables? I think by digital tables, well, do you mean virtual? I'm not sure what digital tables means. Any idea?
No. Help us out.
We'll let them fill that in more, but there's a question from Paul. Paul, I'm hearing that your focus is on congregational leaders who need to focus on discerning God's work in our neighborhoods. I'm wondering if the focus should be more on our congregational members who need to be mentored by leaders who will be with them modeling that incarnational paradigm. Mark, any comments on that?
Yeah, this is, I'd agree. This is why we raise the leadership question, which the question does too. That even if you take something like the famous list of particular gifts in Ephesians 5:4, I'm always bad at addresses, but the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers list, and too often that's seen as these are the people that need to go do that work, which the text explicitly says no. These are for shaping the life of the congregation in Ephesus in that situation. So the work of an evangelist isn't to do evangelism in that type of gift. It's how does a person who's got this capacity to listen and engage conversation and to attend to the Spirit and participate in that particular work, how do you shape others in the congregation in those particular practices? And so all of this is about leadership, right? So they're standing in a space in between the different elements of that world, between in the midst of people who are in the community, like as our church was in the neighborhood, then that we start learning who among us can in fact help facilitate those conversations more, of all those different types. And so yeah, leaders are about living in ways, engaging conversations, increasing the competencies, the capacities to discern and participate in all of these types of dynamics of the gospel on the ground.
Yeah, I think too, just another brief comment is that as this begins, and as leaders themselves are learning this, it's clear to us that for the majority of members of the congregations, actually engaging their neighborhood in the simple acts of presence and listening is actually a scary thing, because as Mark's pointed out, we've created congregations that are affinity groups, people who look like each other, think like each other, and those become the primary contexts of belonging and identity. And so even stepping into neighborhoods becomes a risky thing and often scary. And I think one of the mentoring roles of leaders is just creating a safe space that this is okay. that not rushing it, not pushing it, but living with people in their anxiety and walking with them. That's one of the ways of modeling incarnational paradigms. I think it would be less helpful if leaders acted as if they have already done this and they know how to do it and just follow me. That would not be mentoring at the beginning of this process. So, yeah. Jodine, if I said that correctly, I'm a new pastor at a church in Australia, where Mark and I have been quite a number of times. The default of the congregation is rational intellectualism and being busy. Boy, have we heard that before. How do you introduce discerning the spirit when this default is so strong? Mark, let me pass that to you again. I'll get out of that loop right.
Yeah, the only way I know is most of the time, using the vernacular of how change works in cultures. I'm assuming a lot of the listeners are aware of these questions about early adopters and late adopters and all this. And it's often helpful to kind of notice that, say in your congregation, if you're noticing, if you do have a handful of people in some existing structures that you can just leave in place. So how do you engage the text? And then how do you have them take that text with them as they live into their week and then come back? Did that text change what you perceived out in the community? And I've seen this happen repeatedly in churches, that just their normal lives, and they come back and the study is different. And then it'd be a matter of finding, again, a handful of people that want to actually do something, experiment with this in some other way. Spend, one lunch in a different place, do something different, connect with some neighbor, do something before work, after school that's a little different, and then report back to the group. And so most of the time we find out that it is the small groups, 3, 5, 6 people, that'll actually say, okay, for the next 3 months, we're going to try something different. And while we've seen lots of ways, we know prescribing particular stuff, as Al says in a binder, isn't going to do it. But we do see that it's small groups within the church that start trying things, encouraging each other, observing and learning from that. And then those stories spread, which again, the pastor can help stories to spread and encourage them to spread those stories themselves. So this is the buzz, right? It's the rumor buzz inside the congregation that actually converts more as the broad middle starts getting interested in what's going on. And so it can be sanctioned in things like sermons, and even some of the stories can come up there. But what's really important is happening as both the experiments and the buzz start shaping new levels of energy and interest.
And a follow-up as well is that one of the things that Mark and I use a lot, what we use a lot in TMN, is that you always begin where people are, not where you want them to be. Yeah. And part of that, most of you on this have done theology, is that this whole journey is shaped by this deep conviction and practice that no human being can be turned into an object of our goals, our priorities, or our strategies. And the moment we do that, we can't go on this journey. So if you have some people in your congregation, or a lot of people who consider themselves deep into the rational and the intellectual, one of the things I would do is I would begin there. What rationally, intellectually are they thinking about? There's lots of issues. Australia has big issues about migration and immigrants and all kinds of stuff. There's lots of stuff that's running around in their heads. I would want to begin there and listen to them, and then learn to ask questions around, where do you see that going on where you live? In the places where you work, in your neighborhood, in the coffee shops, where do you see that going on, and what are you hearing? In other words, you gently and graciously seek to take what is engaging them and turn it into questions of listening and discerning. Now, we could say a whole lot more about that. The second part, being busy. This is huge. This is utterly massive, because in our middle-class churches, by and large, people are simply chained to this ongoing runaround of being busy. And this is not a quick fix, easy to get out. and I'd love to have more conversation about this because it's so critical. Part of my hunch and experience is that until our folk, the rational and the elect, will begin to connect with others in the community who are not them and are not part of their church and begin listening, they will not be able to name for themselves, I'm so damn busy, I don't have time for this. And it's until they get there, you can't begin to shift the imagination. So that's a huge, big work that I'd love to be able to talk more about, but I think that's probably enough for the moment, but it's a great question. Mark, you may want to introduce Anonymous's question.
Oh, okay. How do we distinguish between the work of the Spirit in the community and the values the community may already, that may not be of the Spirit, the isms? This is pushing into discernment, which discernment is always a matter of how do we bring in our living into a text, our living into conversations, because God's at work among each other and even neighbors, even non-believing neighbors, and particular opportunities that seem to be what the Spirit's opening up. So, for instance, it's not uncommon if you're aware of some new possibilities in your community that do express values parallel to the kingdom of God: care for children or elderly or widows, care for justice, working on economic issues. That there are many things that really are all over Scripture. So it's not a matter of having to make any of that up. And often it's in those conversations then, as you engage on a human level with people with whom you have some share of caring about what makes civic life, social life, would make it better. These are things God's genuinely concerned about. God doesn't dismiss that and have just a future for us. God's deeply caring about and engaged in a world that expresses this kind of love and care and generosity for each other. And then what I've seen is that as I or others engage those, that's where relationships get built. Numerous times, I remember even back in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, in the midst of civil rights, it was pretty easy in the midst of a march or a meeting or a gathering to talk about why I'm there, and I'm there because of Jesus. I mean, that conversation belonged there. Everybody thought it belonged there. Well, there was no sense, well, keep that stuff out. We're just here for something else. And I find that true today as we're involved in again, with our church, because of the families in our church, that we have significant connections into gang-impacted families, to say, oh, we're not going to talk about that. That's a different kind of issue. But in fact, it's right in the midst of conversations with those families that we find the capacity to discern what the Spirit is doing, and that talk about Jesus belongs right there. And so I don't, the other issue there you're raising is there are values and powers and influences in the community that aren't of the gospel. And so those conversations can also deal with that. Materialism, selfishness, abuse of power, objectifying each other, on and on. That there are definitely those two. But again, those are conversations. I have no difficulty finding out that I can talk about those kind of issues too. What isn't working here? What's been hard on our community? Or to talk about raising our kids, or all the other things that are just normal human neighborly conversations.
Yeah, this is the narrative I have for this is I talk about the leader. The metaphor I use is an abbot, and part of what an abbot does is really assist and cultivate the spaces where the people of a faith community, of a congregation, are invited into spaces where they can raise the questions and talk about what's going on in the rhythms of their lives out in the community. And that's a work of wisdom. It's a work of discernment. It's a work that brings a lot of the theological formation that pastors have been given. But it's not primarily a work of let me teach you and tell you. It's a work of listening, and listening not just at the surface but underneath. So there's a huge work here for leaders in that, what I will call abbess role. That's one. Number two, the joyful thing is that what we're talking about is that people in our congregations actually begin to engage and enter the neighborhoods and communities where they live. And I would expect it to be natural in those engagements and relationalities for them then to be confronted by questions of faith and belief that they'd never really thought about before. And so if you'd listen to what Marcus described, that people come back together around scripture, around table, and they share the stories of what they've been experiencing. They dwell in the word, and it's in the midst of that that people in congregations can wrestle in all kinds of fresh ways with what does it mean to be God's people in the midst of this. And those become the contexts where those issues of values and isms start to find places of getting worked out. But part of what your question raises is, it is risky and it is iffy. Mm-hmm. But I'd sooner have that than the kind of the conformity of most congregations or the programatizing. And it's such an amazing gift for a leader to become an abbot, helping people to shape their understanding around the gospel in terms of what they're engaging.
That kind of fits. There's a question that showed up in the chat. Hi, Janice Ogoshi. Around how do you, in a congregation where the habits are deeply into an evangelical mode that everybody understands personal salvation, coming to Jesus personally is kind of the definition of the gospel. And how do you work in that kind of environment toward a larger understanding of how do we participate in God's mission in the world? And by far the best ways that I know are just around these practices. What happens when, over a period of time, not just one reading, teaching, single shot in a Sunday school class or one sermon, but dwell for months and months and months in passages where they're hearing Jesus say something much broader. So it totally, these issues of personal allegiance to Jesus really matter to all of us. And so how do you both affirm that as well as say, here's what happens with allegiance to Jesus. Here's what the kind of community that Jesus is wanting to shape. And even watching Jesus with the disciples, whether it's in the Luke 10 passage or others, Luke 4 in the Nazareth sermon, where everybody's excited about the coming kingdom of God till it finds out they've got to deal with Gentiles. And now we're just kind of, get rid of him. And so what passage or two passages or three passages can you dwell in over a period of time? And then even say, take this passage this week, ask God to show you what this passage means during your days, and then bring that back. So again, you're trusting them. You're trusting them with the Spirit, and you're moving it into practices to get out of the classroom. And then they'll tell those stories. I've just seen repeatedly as this stuff comes back into Sundays or whatever times you have gathering. God is totally engaged in this. And so as you do it, it'll mess with any plan you even have as a pastor. But there will be the stories start coming up, and as the members listen to each other, they'll start finding out that they had bracketed certain conversations because the conversation was supposed to just be about X. And once you broaden that and bring in other stories, then God really messes and starts making connections between scripture and daily life that are pretty stunning.
Alan and Mark, I'm wondering if something that you said a few times through the last hour was that there are these rhythms of life, and there's this fertile ground that needs to be present for leaders to let go of their need to be in control. And I'm wondering if, maybe even in closing, if there aren't any other questions, you can just reflect on what are those types of steps for leaders to take? What does it look like to build that kind of fertile ground? You talked about your class and how they began that year where they took 20% of their time in the neighborhood without their collars on was that really important first step. But I'm wondering if you can just reflect a little bit more, like what does it look like to create that fertile ground in order to take those steps of beginning to let go of the need to control?
So much of this, let me just talk briefly about Jesuit Examine. And this is just personal practice. During my doctoral work, I was at a Jesuit university and started learning more about what I'd read about and done a little bit on earlier. But I tend to be a fairly rational person. This, it's all the INTJ, it's the Enneagram 8. Anybody that knows the code language knows what that means. And so I will sort through the reasons and the issues and the topics, pretending that that's all that matters. But maybe just as I've gotten older, I'm more and more aware of what's going on in me in the way of anxieties, fears, excitement, longing, frustrations, all of those things. And what the Jesuits teach isn't let the emotions have the run of the place, but as I learn to listen to those and to attend to where they show up and any patterns in that. And I said, I do that in a daily way. My longings and my fears teach me things, teach me about others, teach me about myself. And in fact, as I pay more attention to that in myself, I become more capable of attending to it in a neighbor or a church member. And so I can ask, as they may bring up a barrage of an argument, I can say, you're afraid of something. And that changes the conversation, right? And so this practice, which just takes a handful of minutes a day, is changing the way that I do other things. So this practice in my prayer life changes the way that I lead, changes the way that I love a neighbor or a member. Lectio also, there's all types of ways in our different traditions in a group like this that have to do with how do you live in Scripture in a way that you're listening rather than controlling. And then I think there's just other practices around the day. What kind of disciplines do we need to put on our social media life? My guess is if church members, church leaders put their Facebook time into the neighborhood, we'd have a revival that would be hard to stop. So I just think that first part of it is noticing, isn't it? It's becoming aware of the current things that we submitted to. We've given our energy and our freedom and our competencies and our lives to. And some tweaking of that then can open up all kinds of new opportunities.
Thank you. I'm going to, I think there's one more question, but what I'm going to do is actually just ask Al if you would just sort of close for us in a way, just sort of summation, do a little summary or closing. I'm going to pop up a poll just for some feedback on the hour. And then I think Mark and Al, we can stick around and address that question. And of course, everyone's welcome to stick around. There was one other question, I think, from Michael. So I'll just pass it over to you again, Al.
Well, I think we've just touched our toes into so many of these pieces. And it's exactly these kinds of questions practically on the ground. For example, how do you not create an us them when you're doing this? That we really want to engage in one another. And so we just encourage you, so we can respect our time, and those of you that need to can leave. Follow the link in the chat or email, and if you're interested in being part of this first learning community, that's the place to do it. It really is going to be engaged on these very concrete questions about, I get this, but in my context, what if? And so we invite you to go to the website, fill in the poll, and join with us. And we hope that you'll do that and join us in other webinars that will be coming along. So thank you so much. Mark and I have found this very stimulating.
Yeah, this is fun.
Yeah.
We enjoy this.
And for any who would like to just stick around for a little while, then we can connect with a few other questions before we go. So for the rest, thanks very much, and God's peace go with you.